been a long time since I've done a genre spotlight video, so today we're talking about the fantasy genre. Now, you're probably already at least a little bit familiar with the fantasy genre, and you probably have a pretty good idea of what it is. Stories that not only are not true, but couldn't possibly ever happen. Things like magic spells, witches, wizards, unicorns, dragons, things like that. The fantasy genre is both very old and relatively recent. What I mean by that is that there are a lot of old stories, like the Odyssey, the King Arthur legends, and fairy tales, that incorporate elements of what we would consider to be fantasy. But those are not fantasy novels in the sense that we know them today. In a lot of cases, they're not novels at all. They're poetry or folk tales or myths. At the same time, though, they're definitely either kind of predecessors of the fantasy genre or early examples of it, so it goes way, way back. One of the big differences with myths and legends, though, is that they were at least theoretically true. King Arthur, for instance, was theoretically a real king of Britain, whereas fantasy novels in the present day, you read them knowing that they're not true. They're more like folk tales or fairy tales in that sense. There were a lot of children's fantasy novels published in the 19th and early 20th centuries, things like Peter Pan, Alice in Wonderland, The Wizard of Oz, and so on and so forth. But for a long time it was mostly considered a genre for children and wasn't really as popular with adults. In fact, there would probably be people who would still say it's mostly a genre for children, but there are a lot of examples nowadays of fantasy novels that are written for adults, or, even ones that are not appropriate for children, like Game of Thrones, for instance. However, there were also novels that were written in the 19th century that involved supernatural aspects, but were definitely more geared toward adult audiences. Things like, for instance, Dracula, which is about a vampire. So, that's clearly, it's not technically fantasy. It's more of Gothic literature and kind of a predecessor to the horror genre. But it is a novel in which the things that happen are completely impossible. One of the big game changers in the 20th century was Tolkien's Lord of the Rings series. They were a huge turning point, and a lot of what we think of as modern fantasy comes from Tolkien. The idea that you have in your head of wizards and elves and dragons and whatnot, that kind of high fantasy setting, that's very Tolkien. Of course, though, it did not stop there. There were a lot of fantasy books that were published in the late 20th and the 21st centuries. In the present day, it's such a broad genre. There are books that are inspired by mythology or fairy tales. There are books that are high fantasy along the lines of The Lord of the Rings, children's and young adult fantasy, more dark and gritty fantasy along the lines of Game of Thrones, magical realism where you have supernatural things happening in an otherwise mundane kind of story. For example, 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Urban fantasy taking place in a modern day city rather than an old, kind of fake medieval setting. There are portal fantasy stories like The Chronicles of Narnia or The Wizard of Oz, where people from the real world find their way into a fictional setting, a fantasy setting. Historical fantasy or alternate history stories that take some aspect of the real past and change it. There's a wide variety of fantasy. So one question that I think is really interesting to consider with such a broad spectrum of what's included in fantasy, what is the one unifying factor that makes it fantasy? And what makes it different from another similar genre like, for instance, science fiction? Theoretically, science fiction stories are about things that could potentially happen but haven't yet, whereas fantasy stories are about things that couldn't happen. Science fiction is also often set in the future, whereas fantasy is often either in the present or the past, or in a world that looks very similar to the past. However, I do have a problem with that because Star Wars, if you think about it, is basically a fantasy story. It takes place a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. It's not the future. It looks futuristic. They've got faster than light space travel and all of that, but it's technically the distant past, a long time ago in a land far away. It's very fairy tale-like. And then secondly, there's very little of the technology in Star Wars that isn't just pure fantasy. I mean, okay, so the faster than light space travel is something that science fiction just accepts as a thing, even though it's not likely to ever be a thing. But then what about the Force? The Force is basically space magic. And you've got all these fantasy archetypes, the everyman hero, the princess in distress, and so on and so forth. But people would usually say it's science fiction. Why? Well, because there are spaceships and robots. So there's a blurry line between the genres of science fiction and fantasy, and there's a wide scope of what fantasy includes, which makes sense because it's a very old genre that can be dated back even to mythology and legends and folktales and fairy tales and things like that. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. One of the reasons that I chose to do fantasy for my genre spotlight this month is because I'm actually going to be reading The Lord of the Rings for catching up on the classics. I've read it before, but only once and a long time ago, so I'm revisiting that. And I'm also going to be making a series of videos about the hero's journey this month. The hero's journey is a story structure that is often used in fantasy, so I thought that this video would be, very relevant to that as well. So if you're interested in seeing any of that, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.